Welcome to another edition of Focus on Alternatives, hosted by ADISA, the Alternative and Direct Investment Securities Association. I'm Damon Elder, publisher of the DIWire.com, and I'm joined today by Mike Kell, Senior Vice President with iCapital. So Mike, thanks for joining us today, and we're going to discuss something that's right in your wheelhouse, which is kind of the complex nature of alternatives and the compliance considerations that financial professionals really have to take into consideration when they're going to advise their clients in regards to investment in alternatives. So alternatives are considered complex investment products. So and there are just a host of different compliance regulations and considerations that financial professionals really need to take into account. From your perspective, what's really the most significant one, or the one they really need to pay the most attention to?
Well, I'll tell you, there's certainly a number of them. We'll touch on a few of them here today, but I would say one of them is probably the most simplistic, but often overlooked, and that's the concept of truly understanding, having a foundational understanding of alternative investments. And ultimately what that starts with is really understanding what alternative investments are, why you might consider them for your clients, what the different structures and strategies are, and then ultimately understanding how they fit in a portfolio from an asset allocation perspective. Once you have a foundational understanding of alternative investments, then it's very important to understand the fund or funds that you're considering for investing on behalf of your clients. No two funds are identical, even those with the same structure, strategy, or asset class. So it's very important to understand the nuances of each individual fund that you're considering for investing on behalf of your clients.
Mike, so once a financial professional really has that keen understanding of an alternative investment or multiple alternative investments and how they're going to kind of fit into an investor's portfolio, what are some of the obligations that they maintain before actually allocating to one of those investments?
I think there's really two more that come to mind. Once they have that foundational understanding of alternative investments and they understand the products themselves, it really comes to two things. One is the considering reasonable alternatives, but then also initial due diligence for each of the funds. Now, specific to reasonable alternatives, whether you are an advisor under the fiduciary rule or whether you're a registered representative under regulation best interest, the obligations are similar. And it makes sense that before you invest in a particular fund on behalf of your client, it's prudent to make sure that you consider reasonable alternatives to ensure that that particular fund that you do choose is in the best interest of your client. Now, as we think about initial due diligence obligations, it's very important to verify the details of a fund as well as a history of that manager before you actually invest in that fund so that you can have the best chance of positive outcomes.
Great, Mike. So, once a financial professional understands the product, the complexity of it, they've reviewed reasonable alternatives for their client, and they've done their initial due diligence, what are some of the other obligations that they still entail and have to consider from an ongoing perspective through their ongoing consultation of their clients?
Well, I think that's exactly the point, that the fact that these are truly illiquid investments, they go for a long time, and just because you make the sale on day one or the recommendation on day one, your obligation doesn't stop. You have an obligation to continue monitoring that from an ongoing perspective, and that's the likes of whether it's monthly performance reports, whether it's updates to the offering documents, understanding the underlying investments that are being purchased, looking at things like style drift, et cetera. And ultimately what you have to do is you have to justify the hold recommendation. So it is a liquid. You might not be able to get out of the investment, even if you don't think that it's still favorable, but you still are justifying a hold recommendation. So remember, if you're a registered rep that received upfront compensation or even maybe a trail commission going forward, or you're an investment advisor continuing to charge a fee for service, you have to prove the fact that you're earning that fee. And part of earning that fee is conducting that ongoing diligence throughout the life of the fund, even if you cannot redeem it because it is illiquid in nature.
Well, that brings up a good point, Mike, because we keep seeing these reports and these studies and these surveys that are constantly saying that RIAs and other investment advisors are looking to allocate more to alts. And yet, I don't think the industry's really been seeing a huge uptick in RIAs bringing their clients into alts. So, why is that, or am I wrong?
Well, I think historically that might have been more accurate. I do think recently you have seen a shift over the past handful of years that more of the allocation to alternative investments are actually shifting from the predominant registered representative at IBDs going to the RIAs and the wires and large banks, et cetera.
So, Mike, we've talked a bit about, the complex nature of this whole alternative investment space, and we could spend hours talking about it, but is there any one final topic you want to touch on before we wrap up?
I would just say really two things. Number one is documentation. We say it all the time. It seems like a small hurdle, but it is something that goes by the wayside all too often. All of these obligations that we discussed, it all has to be documented. Why? Because typically, even during a routine regulatory exam, this is something that's going to come up years down the road. You're not going to remember all of this wonderful things that you did to support their recommendation. So document everything that you do so that during a routine regulatory exam, you have the information at your fingertips. Secondly, this is a very laborious process. There are ample service providers that are happy to help every step of the way. One key point is that the obligation falls on you as the financial professional. So you cannot shift that obligation completely. You can use service providers to help you fulfill those obligations, but remember the key point there is you cannot shift that obligation in its entirety.
Well, I think many people understand that the financial services industry is probably the most heavily regulated one in the country. And certainly you got to dot your I's, cross your T's, keep yourself out of trouble, and make sure you're doing your job properly. So, Mike, thanks so much for joining us today. And thank you for joining us for another episode of Focus on Alternatives, hosted by ADISA. For more information on alternative investments, please visit adisa.org. And of course, feel free to visit thediyWire.com for your daily news. Thanks so much.